Deep Politics and the Death of JFK. There's a great deal of information in this book that is new, but there's also a great deal that I would say is reanalyzed. You've broadened the vision of people considering JFK to consider something else, that there was something underlying what happened with, say, let's start with to the Rosenbergs, particularly Ethel Rosenberg, and then the McCarthy era, and then we got to the assassinations, and we also got into the Watergate scandal, Contragate. We talk about the mafia. You have developed a new vision, I think, that you would call deep politics, that links this all together, and developed, I guess, or encouraged a new way of thinking about the JFK assassination, which is not to simply try and figure out who did it and when they did it, but to talk about the why and what was going on underneath and what was the structural connection in this culture, in the political system.
Yes.
So I want you to start by, before we even get into any of the specific facts, although I know you will mention some, I want you to remind people what you meant by parapolitics, and now what your definition would be of deep politics, because this is going to be coming up again and again over the next hour and a half or 2 hours.
I think this is helpful to begin with the question of definitions, and it's a way of also showing the difference in what I'm doing now and what I did 20 years ago. The devoted KPFA listeners have listened to me for a long time on these subjects. When I talked about parapolitics, I defined it, in fact, in the War Conspiracy as a system or process of politics in which responsibility is consciously diminished. I mean, covert operations would be a good example. You do it, but you try to make it appear that it's not you that's doing it, someone else that's doing it. So it focused very much, parapolitics, on the activity of the CIA and other government agencies like the FBI and Army Intelligence.
Now, let's be clear, you're saying parapolitics because the two sound a little bit alike. So this is PARA politics we're talking about.
Right. I think my own researches were carrying me beyond parapolitics before I realized that. The last chapter in the War Conspiracy, which was like the introduction to so much of what I've done since, was looking at the relationship between the CIA and the drug traffic in the Far East and how the interaction between the two was a factor in this inexorable pushing of the United States towards ever and ever greater involvement in Southeast Asia, a push that was not so much coming out of the White House as it was out of the woodwork, so to speak. Now, the drug traffic cannot be reduced to an invention of the CIA. It's something that was there long before there was a CIA. It has its own dynamics. You can say this about organized crime in general, that even if it's convenient for wealthy corporations to know there's a mafia down there corrupting City Hall, because although the mafia may have quite different reasons for corrupting City Hall, once City Hall is corrupted, everybody benefits in the great capitalist potlatch where the government is used to help all kinds of interests. But you cannot reduce organized crime to some kind of instrumentality of the corporations. They are their own reality. So this is where I come up with the notion of deep politics, that our political system is and has been, as far back as I've been able to trace it, one in which the acknowledged processes, the things that I read about when I was a student of political science in the university, have always rested on a deeper system of relationships which cannot be so recognized and, in fact, are repressed, and about which every one of us, including the two of us in this room, are in a constant system of denial. That is to say, we cannot fully open up our mind to the extent to which this deep political level is conditioning politics all along, because that's too uncomfortable to the illusion that we like to live in, which is we're in a democracy, and if we go out and work hard in the next election, we can somehow build towards the political system that we desire. My whole first chapter in defining deep politics goes immediately into the amount of denial that we are all in. The establishment likes to give a psychological dimension, and so do the what I call the establishment left, refer to the psychological aspects of the mentalities that go into looking at the Kennedy assassination, and say, with some justification, that they have a paranoid streak and so on. But there's also a psychological dimension to the mainstream, whether it's the New York Times or whether it's Coburn in The Nation, who say that there wasn't a conspiracy, and even if there were, conspiracies have nothing to do with our political system. There's a surprising degree of unanimity here between The Nation and the New York Times, and the common denominator is repressing the idea that dark events like plotted assassinations really are integral to the structure of the politics of this nation. The Nation magazine sets up an antithesis between a rational structuralist analysis and the conspiratorialists who are trying to see influence on our politics from events like assassinations. What I'm
trying to isolate the so-called main system from the darker side of the political system, which you document in various books has been operating for many, many years.
Continuously.
Right.
And it's not really so much that I come up with a hypothesis that there is a connection between, say, the Kennedy assassination and Watergate. It was really working backwards from the evidence that I'd already produced a manuscript in 1971 that focused on the activities of somebody called either Frank Fiorini or Frank Sturgis, so that I had a very special take on the Watergate break-in in 1972 when Frank Sturgis was one of the 4 people photographed on page 1 of the New York Times. It has been a question of explaining that relationship. And the explanation I have now makes Frank Sturgis a pretty minor figure, really. He's just one of the many, many ways in which there is a kind of milieu or area where, what I call a gray zone sometimes, where intelligence agencies and organized crime overlap. After all, they're both involved in rather similar activities, so it isn't all that surprising, except that the CIA is supposed to commit its crimes in other countries and not in this one. I'm suggesting that once we take a better look at the deep politics of our country, you cannot compartmentalize the CIA in one area and organized crime in another area. They are both manifestations of the way business is frequently done on the criminal level, on the government level, and also, I keep coming back to this in my book, on the corporate level.
And this is what you mean by the deep political politics or deep politics, this link.
Right. Really, you have to say the deep political economy of our country, because it would be very wrong to leave the corporations out of this picture. And I think I'm probably one of the first people. I even aroused a certain amount of derision at me because I say that we have to look not only at the little groups that were manipulating or controlling Oswald when he was in New Orleans, but look at their relationship to the 2 big banana companies, United Fruit and Standard Fruit, who normally had resorted to gangs and organized crime to control the so-called banana republics of Central America.
Perhaps a good way now to enter the path of your book and even before I ask some of these big questions about the links between these various events, if you will, that have happened through the years, I want to, perhaps you can talk deep politics in terms of the Kennedy assassination and perhaps talk about both the two national security memorandum and the denial of the memorandum. What happened to Kennedy and to Kennedy policy before the assassination and after the assassination?
Yes, unfortunately, in my book, I only do this with respect to Vietnam. It should have also. I have written about.
Yes, okay.
I have written about Kennedy's policies in Cuba. That has become such a confused area now. Vietnam being just about as confused. I'm very sorry to find myself on a different side from Noam Chomsky on this issue. Trying to put it as simply as possible, and it's unfortunately a bit misleading to put it simply. There was Kennedy's last National Security Action Memorandum on Vietnam was NASM 263 of October the 11th, and talked about implementing a plan. And here both words, implementation and plan, not an intention, but a plan being implemented, to withdraw 1,000 troops by the end of 1963 with a view of withdrawing the bulk of them by 1965. In other words, it was the first step in a plan which was deliberately timed to take place after the 1964 elections, what we might call a plan for graduated withdrawal, phased withdrawal from Vietnam. Johnson's first National Security Action Memorandum on any subject was NASM 273, dated November 26th, but approved on November 24th, which is to say 2 days after the assassination.
You mean dated October 26th?
No, November. The assassination was November 22nd. Right. This document was approved on November 24th, and it's dated November 26th. And it puts into motion what we're originally planning for graduated escalation. So we have one NASM from the last one from Kennedy is for phased or gradual withdrawal from Vietnam, and the first one from Johnson is for graduated escalation in Vietnam. What is the relationship between the two documents? It's difficult to talk about it in simple terms because Johnson's NASM addressed the issue of withdrawal and reasserted the goals of a public statement that had been made 9 days before Kennedy's NASM, which said talked about publicly about an intention to do this. But we have to distinguish in our minds between an intention and the implementation of a plan. And what I'm saying in my book is that although Kennedy faced a great many hawks inside his administration who were reluctant to do this, he had given a go-ahead to the doves of whom there were very few, and the chief of whom was probably his own brother, who wanted to cut their losses and get out now, whether or not it looked as if we were going to win. And I don't want to demonize the Johnson memorandum because I'm sure that Johnson did not intend to have the war which we ultimately had. There was probably a consensus in both among doves and hawks at this time that to put U.S. ground troops into Vietnam would be a bad thing, and NASM 273 certainly didn't envisage that. But what NASM 273 explicitly did do was to envisage that the United States itself would become involved in a war against North Vietnam, which would begin by being covert, and did begin by being covert, but would become more and more overt. The planning involved, which, by the way, was already on paper inside the Pentagon, envisage things like the so-called 34A ops, which were patrol boats shooting off torpedoes at the North Vietnamese coastline, and also ELINT missions, U.S. destroyers, seeing how the North Vietnamese responded to this. These gradually escalating operations led to the so-called Tonkin Gulf incidents in August 1964, which to all extents and purposes was the beginning of the shooting war between the United States and Vietnam, as opposed to the covert war which the United States had been running through the South Vietnamese under Kennedy.
And the major phony excuse that Johnson used to escalate, to involve us in a deeper
yes.
way. Talking with Peter Dale Scott. He is the author of Deep Politics, new book, and it's called Deep Politics and the Death of JFK. And we're talking about the assassination of JFK, but we're talking about a system of deep political, economic action that has been happening in this country, according to Peter Dale Scott, consistently. You know, you talk about these memorandums, and it was suggested in Oliver Stone's film, which showed these memorandums for about
6 seconds.
6 seconds.
Right.
And you make an interesting parallel about the 6 seconds that shook
Dallas.
in Dallas. And it's suggested that it's been suggested, I guess, by you and I guess by John Newman in a very well-documented book, that this may well have been the policy by Kennedy that both got him in trouble with all the various players in the deep political system, if you will, and that may have led to his assassination.
Now, could I be very clear about this?
Please do.
Neither John Newman nor I, neither of us are saying that this is why President Kennedy was assassinated. We are only saying, and I'll speak for myself here, that there was enormous tension, conflict within the system on this issue. The problem is that there are so many possible motives for assassinating the president. There was also Bobby Kennedy's campaign against organized crime. Kennedy's policies on Cuba suffered from the same kind of disease that did his policies in Vietnam. In both areas, he had a way of proceeding that allowed both hawks and doves to think that they had a hope within his administration. He wasn't clearly on one side or the other until this final determination in Vietnam. So, and I actually believe that if we did know why Kennedy was killed, it would almost certainly involve a coalition of diverse groups with diverse motives, of which Vietnam may very well have been one, but I have no way of demonstrating that it would have been one of the motives, just as I have no way of demonstrating that Kennedy would have withdrawn. This is another false issue that's come up, which I can't address. I am simply saying that he had implemented a plan to withdraw, and that, let's be clear about this, that this was quietly annulled by Johnson's NASM 273, even while it was using the formula of reasserting the intention of withdrawal. And those are the facts that we have to begin to deal with when we start looking, as I do in this book, at the very odd behavior of the military, and particularly military intelligence, with respect to the assassination. You could argue that it's very suspicious that you had Army intelligence agents right there in Dealey Plaza who ended up right inside the Texas School Book Depository at the time that it was sealed off. But, of course, this doesn't prove anything about whether or not Vietnam was a motive for the assassination.
Boy, that's interesting. We're not going to get into this now, but in a very revealing new series that came out of, I think it was the Memphis Appeal, they documented the fact that Martin Luther King was surveilled by military intelligence from the time he was in college to the fact that they were on the ground the day within hundreds of yards of where he was killed.
That's extremely relevant, and in my book I also note that Army intelligence had a file on Sirhan Sirhan, the supposed assassin of Robert Kennedy, probably predating Robert Kennedy's assassination.
Okay, I want to ask you a big question here and give you some time to respond to it. And I think this will get us into the heart of the matter, although we've been there already. You talked before about there would be, you would think that there would be or feel that there would be a coalition of diverse groups, or you've documented that there is a good deal of information that suggests that there would be a coalition of diverse groups that would want Kennedy dead. Like a lot of people had a lot of reasons to want to get rid of him. I want you to talk about what those different groups would be and what the reasons would be for wanting Kennedy dead. Does this bring in organized crime and drug wars and the use of drugs by organized crime to make money and by the CIA to finance operations? Who are these diverse groups that we're talking about in terms of wanting JFK dead, and why would they want him dead?
Well, I have a chapter on the coalitions, plural, against the Kennedys, in which I begin by talking about all those people connected with the Teamsters, not just people like Jimmy Hoffa himself, but very much those people ranging from the Murchison family to pure organized crime groups who were being given very liberal sources of capital in the form of loans from the Central States Teamsters Pension Fund, which many of these loans never being paid off at all. And of course, Bobby Kennedy was going right after Jimmy Hoffa, and in fact, the trial of Jimmy Hoffa and the Warren Commission investigation of the Kennedy assassination both took place in 1964, and I argue in yet another chapter that they influenced each other, and that a key witness in the Hoffa trial down in Tennessee, Parton, many people were telling the FBI all through this period that he was somehow involved with the Kennedy assassination, or with a man called David Ferry, who other people said was involved with the Kennedy assassination. And that one of the reasons that Bobby Kennedy didn't want to get into conspiracy theories about his brother's death is that this would have opened up the door on these allegations, which I think were false allegations, against, he was still the Attorney General, and Parton was his key witness in the key case against Hoffa. So that's one big area. And then I talk a bit about a lobbyist called Irving Davidson, who represented a number of the people who were in these in these coalitions, the Murchisons in particular. Offshore interests, the government of Nicaragua is somehow drawn into this case, one of their agents having supplied a false but rather important, significant story that Oswald had been hired in the Cuban embassy in Mexico City to kill the president. We have to understand that the creating of a false KGB or Cuban plot, the appearance of this, although it had no grounding in reality, it had a lot of plausible backing in government files at the time the assassination occurred. A lot of this had been put in there pre-assassination. And so that a very real motive for the government saying that Oswald acted alone was to get the nuclear Air Force back on the ground, because we were in a red alert right after President Kennedy was killed. And sane heads in the government did not want to go to war against the Soviet Union. A lot of insane heads in the government did want to go to war, and even more, wanted very, very vigorously and actively for about 7 or 8 weeks after the assassination to retaliate against Cuba. And I believe that this is what persuaded Earl Warren and some other people to go along with this Warren Commission notion, which in terms of the way it was set up without any investigatory powers, really had very little alternative but to believe the agencies who were feeding it intelligence. And the FBI in particular was committed to the idea that Oswald did it and did it alone as early as certainly 3 days, maybe much earlier, in fact, 3 days after the assassination.
I guess one just has to mention here, I guess the absurdity also accompanied by the lack of questioning of the fact that CIA Director Dulles was essentially a key player in...
He was, of course, former CIA director
at the time,
but he was a more active person probably even than Warren on the Warren Commission.
Why don't you just talk a little bit about the role that this former CIA director played in the Warren Commission and what it ultimately turned into?
Well, first of all, I mean, he had been, let's remember, he had been essentially fired by Kennedy because of the failure of the Bay of Pigs operation, which Dulles felt and allowed some of his friends in the media to tell the world through Fortune magazine, had really been Kennedy's failure, not his failure, because if only Kennedy had gone and sent in the U.S. Air Force, they could have saved the operation. Now, this is a debate which still goes on. I happen to be of the camp that says that the Bay of Pigs was madness from start to finish, but a lot of people, particularly inside the CIA, believed that it should have succeeded and that Kennedy was the culprit. So there was a feeling of betrayal that tainted the air when Dulles went on the commission. Dulles also had a lot to hide. He had to hide the fact that the CIA had been... Oswald was supposed to be a loner, according to the official version, but the CIA had been sending out falsified information about Oswald less than 2 months before the assassination. So the CIA had a lot to hide, and the Warren Commission did the job of hiding it, and this was essentially Dulles's job. Everyone concedes now, even the Posner book, for example, everybody concedes that the CIA was hiding things from the Warren Commission, and usually it's put onto rather neutral issues, like the fact that there was a KGB defector or alleged defector, Nozenko, who had come over to say that the KGB had nothing to do with Oswald, and this was a great big thorny issue that the Warren Commission decided not to publish. Or there was the Amlash plots, the fact that Desmond Fitzgerald was meeting or scheduled to
remind people he is...
Desmond Fitzgerald was at that moment the head of the special affairs staff of the CIA, who was going to meet with a CIA operative agent or perhaps double agent who was to assassinate Castro. So there was the whole issue, very sensitive issue, not conceded at all at that time, that the CIA had been plotting the assassination of Castro, at times using organized crime figures like John Roselli. All of that was sensitive, but the most sensitive of all, I think, was that the CIA had already in its own files and documents created an appearance of a contact between Oswald and a man called Valery Kostakov, a KGB agent in Mexico City, who they had already pre-assassination, rightly or wrongly, identified as a KGB expert on assassinations. On the other matters, the CIA might conceivably have nothing to do with the actual case, but inasmuch as Oswald was the designated patsy, The fact that the CIA officials, by falsifying documents, had already made him look like a potential KGB assassin. This was a very, very sensitive matter, and this is something that is really just beginning to come out now with the declassified documents, although we've known something of it for some years. So Dulles, you might say, is a key figure on the Warren Commission. But in my first chapter, and again later, I go on to say, let's not focus on Dulles alone, that most of the people, not all, but a good many of the people on the commission had a kind of privileged relationship to the subject areas that we were going into, and I point to just two. One was Hale Boggs, who was elected from Louisiana, with the help of Marcello, and an organized crime leader in New Orleans. And if an honest investigation would have been led through the Oswald family and through Oswald's own activities in New Orleans, to look at the 544 Camp Street address, which he stamped on his literature, which would take us to this ex-FBI agent, Guy Bannister, who had simultaneously excellent relations with the FBI, to whom he reported on Cuban exile activities, for which Oswald might have been possibly gathering information for him, and also had a very intimate relationship with the investigators and lawyers protecting Carlos Marcello against deportation by Bobby Kennedy.
I just want to stay with Hale Boggs for a moment. I took careful note that when the Oliver Stone film first came out, ABC, I guess Sunday with David Brinkley, whatever that program is called, had on several journalists to give their view of how the film was, and one of those was Cokie Roberts.
Yes.
And Cokie Roberts went on to say it was garbage, junk, an insult to the men on the Warren Commission. Do you suppose this might have been a subtle continuation of the cover-up?
You mean because of who her father was?
Well, her father was Hale Boggs.
Yes, right. Yes. No, I certainly... because I'm talking about a system here, I want to say right out that every time we focus on individuals like this, we mustn't individualize the situation and say, aha, now we've got the key to it. It's the fact that Cokie Roberts was the daughter of Hale Boggs. I'm saying that there is a style of political activity in Washington which unites all kinds of people from the very top of the overworld to the very bottom of the underworld, and that when we're going through instances of this, we have to look at them as part of the system without focusing on them uniquely. So I'd like to go quickly to yet someone else in the Warren Commission, a lawyer called Albert Jenner, who at the same time was the chief counsel for General Dynamics, and you had and coming back to the coalitions that were uniting against the Kennedys, a lot of dirt was beginning to surface in the fall of 1963 about corrupt Texas politicians, including those people who had secured through lobbying and then profited from a very controversial Pentagon contract awarding the development of the so-called TFX experimental fighter plane to a General Dynamics plant in Fort Worth. Well, that scandal, what we can call it the TFX scandal or the General Dynamics scandal, is certainly part of the deep politics of the assassination. And so it becomes relevant that Albert Jenner, who was the counsel for General Dynamics, was then put on the staff of the Warren Commission. Specifically, it's been alleged, with the responsibility of investigating conspiracies. He also, through General Dynamics, represented one of the chief shareholders, the chief shareholder in General Dynamics, who had a number of contacts with organized crime figures in Chicago, as did Jack Ruby. And in fact, one of the people that Jack Ruby is alleged to have had contact with in 1963, and another one whom he definitely telephoned, were subsequently represented by this same Albert Jenner, who was, we have to understand, also had good links with the overworld, but at times could represent the underworld as well. So in this way, it isn't a matter of individuals. And in fact, that's my big quarrel with nearly all of the books that have been written about the Kennedy assassination, whether they are saying that Oswald did do it and acted alone, like Posner, or whether they're saying that Oswald didn't do it and some kind of external conspiracy did it. My book is not a conspiracy book in the ordinary sense, because a conspiracy is a group of people you isolate from the rest of the system, the kind of alien bug or virus or germ that is responsible for something going wrong. And I'm saying that if we're looking for what was wrong, it was something that had been wrong with America long before the Kennedy assassination and has continued to be wrong since, down to the present. The fact that the FBI can cover up for murders, for example, is very glaring in the case of the Kennedy assassination. But the FBI has been involved in a number of murders of dissidents, of Black Panthers, of AIM leaders, and so on. And we have to look at, this is where Ethel Rosenberg comes in, because she was, I would say, in a sense, murdered by the FBI. Whether or not her husband was involved with espionage, the FBI mounted a great campaign to get her arrested and convicted and condemned to death for the quite Machiavellian reason that they thought that this would persuade her husband to confess and implicate himself in order to exonerate her. It didn't happen. They both died together. And two of the FBI agents who are up there at Sing Sing watching the Rosenbergs die, having been deeply involved in this plot, let's call it that if you like, against Ethel Rosenberg, were deeply responsible for the conspiratorial cover-up of the Kennedy assassination and the railroading of Lee Harvey Oswald.
And this is through the FBI's COINTEL program.
It's through their counter-espionage section, which in turn, or counterintelligence section, which in turn became responsible in 1955 for the COINTEL programs, which is short for counterintelligence programs, which were authorized by Eisenhower largely in response to the terrible threat that had been portrayed to him by the FBI, using the Rosenbergs as the chief example.
We're talking with Peter Dale Scott, his new book, Deep Politics and the Death of JFK. He is also, among other books, the author of Cocaine Politics, Drugs, Armies, and the CIA in Central America. And a little bit later in this interview, Peter Dale Scott, we're going to talk about the new documents that have come out and the information around Mexico that sort of links, I guess, the Kennedy assassination with drug trafficking and with the work you've done in Cocaine Politics.
Well, of course, my own book links the Kennedy assassination to drug trafficking through Mexico, and particularly through the fact that the Mexican Ministry of Gobernación, government, and within it a so-called Dirección Federal de Seguridad, which we'll just translate as Security Directorate, which was in effect the Mexican CIA and to some extent Mexican FBI as well, and which enjoyed excellent relations with the CIA station in Mexico City. This DFS was simultaneously an intelligence agency.
That's the Mexico CIA.
Yes, and they investigated. They did a good deal of the investigation of the case in Mexico at the request of the Mexican CIA. We have to be careful here. That when I say the Mexico City CIA station, that's the U.S. government requested the DFS through the Gobernación to arrest and interrogate a witness, Sylvia Duran, she was put under terrible pressure to admit that she herself was part of a colossal KGB Cuban conspiracy to assassinate the president. Now, this DFS was simultaneously an intelligence agency investigating the case, but it had certainly emerged by the 1970s as the key link between the Mexican government and drug trafficking in Mexico. And so we have quite a lot about the DFS in our Cocaine Politics book, quoting another book is saying that, well, actually quoting a government agent is saying, one of our U.S. government agents is saying that a DFS license was a license to traffic in drugs in Mexico, because when the DEA went in there and tried to arrest people, whenever they got to a high enough level, the person they wanted to arrest would produce a little card proving that they were an agent of the DFS. So I have a chapter that goes into the evolution of I have a chapter in Deep Politics and the Death of JFK, which looks at the evolution of the drug traffic in Central America and in Mexico in particular, showing how the gobernación of many countries, Honduras conspicuously, became involved with drug trafficking as a way of controlling their own populations, which is what the CIA has always been interested in, and how in Mexico it led to a kind of government toleration of a drug traffic at the highest level, a drug traffic with which Jack Ruby was probably involved.
And in just a minute, we're gonna sort of zoom into Dallas, and we can talk about what I think is incredibly interesting: the fact that Jack Ruby was apparently working with the local police there as a narcotics informer, and we've got Oswald sort of, I guess, engaged in one way or another in the drug trade. And I mean, this sort of gets fairly interesting. I have to, Peter Dale Scott, I feel in doing this interview that essentially what I'm going to keep doing is asking the same question again and again and again, which is so that we can hone in on what you mean by deep politics and the structural links that make all these so-called independent conspiracies.
Could we talk a bit about Central America, because it's much smaller?
Okay,
it'll be easier, and then we can bring it back home.
Okay, well, why don't you state the thesis about drugs in Central America? Why don't you lay that out for us?
I would say that at least since the Depression in the 1930s, when the banana industry almost went belly up, and both the banana companies were close to bankruptcy, short of funds, the flow of money from the banana companies to the various political parties in a country like Honduras dried up, and the various political parties then turned to drugs to finance themselves, to supplant the income that had been lost from the banana companies. And then there are signs that the Gobernación in Mexico as well, which is of course not a banana republic, that the same thing was happening. And in fact, a Gobernación minister who probably would have become president had to resign before the war, about 1940, because he had been accused of involvement in the drug traffic. So the deep politics there is that although for a while you were having elections of sorts in these countries, that the real sort of energy behind the political system and the governance of the country it continued after you had a strong man in Honduras who suspended elections, and another strong man in Nicaragua, was that the drug traffic and its gangs and its money and its ability to corrupt people was part of the governance system of those small countries. Just as bringing it back home now, in a city like New Orleans, the gangs on the waterfront who, ever since some very messy events of the 1890s, have been called mafia, but should be seen essentially as gangs on the waterfront, have been an integral part of the deep political processes of the city of New Orleans, which explains why Carlos Marcello had a lot of political influence in New Orleans and could regularly elect and re-elect men who went to Congress in Washington and, in effect, represented the interests of the mafia and would introduce private bills to get particular mafiosi pardoned and so on. This deep political system in the city of New Orleans, to a greater or less extent, has been imitated in other cities as well. And if we come to the city of Dallas, there's a lot of evidence that drug traffickers had been able to corrupt local judges so that if by any chance any of them were arrested, not to worry, the case would be assigned to a particular judge and no lasting damage would be done. Now, the Warren Commission tried to present a picture of Jack Ruby as a loner. And in order to do this, they had to ignore one of the very few FBI files on Jack Ruby that predate the Kennedy assassination, a file of 1956, which was a very good informant who continued to be used successfully as an informant, telling the FBI that her husband, who was a drug trafficker, was involved in a big deal going through Mexican drug trafficking, and for some reason the go-ahead, the green light on the deal in Dallas had to be obtained from Jack Ruby. This indicates that Jack Ruby was the man who had the kind of influence with the Dallas police and with the Dallas judiciary which would allow a deal like this to happen. This was not an isolated report. There were other reports coming in, one of which certainly received by the FBI, but possibly and probably withheld from the Warren Commission, was from a former FBI agent in Dallas, now relocated to, I think, San Diego in California, but reporting very early on that when he was in Dallas, he had the impression that Jack Ruby had a very special influence with the Dallas police. A great many of these reports came in. The Warren Commission ignored all of them. I wrote a book in 1976 you haven't mentioned yet called Crime and Cover-Up, the CIA, Mafia, and Dallas Watergate Connection, in which I put very heavy emphasis on these allegations and on the fact, it's not disputed, that there had been made a major drug bust in Dallas in 1947 or 48, and that Ruby had been implicated in the case, at least to the extent that he was interrogated about the case, and he had been let off because of an alibi that didn't check out and was probably false. And the fact that they let him off so easily indicated to me that he was a government informant way back then on the federal level to the Federal Bureau of Narcotics.
Of course, this suggests perhaps one of the possible reasons why Jack Ruby was capable of getting so close to Oswald in 19...
Because of his influence with the Dallas police.
Apparently knew everybody there.
Now, the House committee went further than the Warren Commission, and they suggested there was probably a conspiracy to get Ruby into the basement. They discovered that a door was left unlocked and that the people who were supposed to be guarding the door had been reassigned shortly before Ruby came in and killed Oswald. So here was a door that was both open and unguarded. And they added to this that the man in charge of all this, they pointed the finger at a Sergeant Patrick Dean, who, interestingly, knew quite well Joseph Civello, who was the head of organized crime in Dallas. Now, I, in my book, tell how I interviewed this Sergeant Dean, and I find all of this very significant, but I find it falsely presented by the House committee because they're making it look like an external conspiracy involving Sergeant Dean and maybe, or maybe not, Joseph Civello. Well, what I found, and it totally checks out, is Patrick Dean accepts his responsibility for reassigning the two policemen at the door, but he says, my superiors told me to do that. And if you go back and look at the Warren Commission volume on police affidavits, it's very clear that Dean was not acting on his own. And if there's something conspiratorial here, it's not one bad policeman. It is the Dallas police going up almost to the very top. And furthermore, that the reason he knew Civello was because he had been a narcotics detective, and Joe Civello was a narcotics informant. You understand that being a narcotics informant usually means that you have a lot of power because you're the man who decides that the police should arrest A and not arrest B, and that the police will allow B to go on trafficking as long as they can arrest A from time to time, so that everybody's happy. The police are making their arrests, and B is continuing his drug trafficking. And unfortunately, this has been the case in more than one American city. It means that, in a sense, law enforcement and there's what I call a symbiosis between law enforcement and crime. Law enforcement needs to arrest people, and organized criminals, who are almost by definition the ones who are tolerated by law enforcement, provide the people to be arrested. And meanwhile, organized crime wants to go on trafficking, and the law enforcement people tolerate this. This symbiosis between law enforcement and organized crime, which becomes much more activist overseas, where the CIA and the drug trafficking criminals are on the same team to either corrupt or subvert or from time to time overthrow foreign governments, you get the same symbiosis overseas as you do domestically. And Jack Ruby seems to have been an example of this symbiosis in Dallas, but on a transnational level, that is to say, twice at least, and probably recurringly, he was involved with drug deals that went to Mexico, and which at the Mexico end were represented by the DFS, which investigated the assassination of President Kennedy and came up with evidence of a conspiracy, which was enough for Hoover and Johnson and the Warren Commission to decide that they would go with Oswald as the lone assassin.
Peter Dale Scott, perhaps this would be a good time, since we've talked about the way in which the Dallas Police Department may have been compromised by its relationship with Jack Ruby and in the symbiosis you described with organized crime. Perhaps it would be good just to spend a few minutes talking about the way in which the FBI and the CIA acted rather strangely, or what might be of surprise in terms of the way they acted after the assassination.
Well, in the case of the CIA, we really have to talk about what's surprising about how they acted before the assassination. And when I come, my first chapter that looks, before I really look at the crime, I look at the cover-up. And before I look at the cover-up, I look at the fact that the CIA station in Mexico City was churning out documents. Well, I say churning out, but there are two key ones. One dated October 8th, 1963, which arrived in Washington on October 9th, which said that reported from a reliable source, which meant electronic surveillance. They had overheard a conversation in which, and they used language very carefully, a man identified himself as Lee Oswald and referred to a conversation which he had had with Kostikov. The Kostikov being, I've mentioned him before, a consul in the Soviet consulate, who was certainly a KGB agent, and according to certain people within the CIA at that time, an assassination specialist. Now, there's a great deal of cover-up about all of this, but what is very glaring is that they attach to this a description of a man who certainly was not Oswald, and who has been known since to assassination buffs as the mystery man in Mexico City. I doubt that the mystery man is very important in this. The fact that the CIA station was generating intelligence that made it appear that somebody who identified himself as Oswald was linked to a KGB assassinations expert. This was important because in the post-assassination period, you now had two schools of thought inside the CIA. One school of thought, which was clearly centered in the counterintelligence part, headed by James Angleton, which believed that we had a conspiracy here and continued to find more and more evidence of it and to support this evidence, versus other people in the CIA very strongly backed by virtually all of the FBI, saying, no, we know that Oswald acted alone. Most Americans are not aware that there was an intelligence war going on inside the American government in Washington under Johnson as to whether they were going to come down on the side of conspiracy or come down on the side of Oswald acted alone. And it's important to distinguish that there were some people who really wanted to come down on the side of a KGB conspiracy, including Angleton. And there were other people who really did not want to have World War III, but did want to come down heavily for a Cuban conspiracy so that we could then go in and take out Fidel Castro. And this second camp were not finally silenced until sometime late in December. So that there are many people who might have found themselves somewhat on the side of the Oswald acted alone camp as being preferable to my version of the story, which is that elements within the CIA were collaborating with other elements outside the CIA to create a scene for a successful assassination which could not be tracked because of the amount of embarrassing material that was already planted in government files. Now, the CIA certainly had elements within it which were lying. You had elements within the CIA station in Mexico City who were lying to headquarters about Oswald before the assassination, who continued to lie after the assassination. Because the key thing that could have cleared this all up was that they probably took photographs of this man who identified himself as Oswald, and they probably had a tape of his voice. And we could have a whole broadcast on this technical subject. Suffice it to say that they almost certainly had photographs and a tape of this man identifying himself as Oswald after the assassination. That FBI officials, we have an FBI memo that says that FBI officers, agents in Dallas who knew Oswald and had heard his voice, listened to the tape and determined it was not of Oswald. And ever since, people have tried to make light of that and say, oh, well, it was just a mistake. It was someone else. It wasn't Oswald. Suppressing the very relevant fact that this man had identified himself as Oswald. Read this case closed book that he cannot deal with this crucial fact here. Somebody had identified himself as Oswald, and he almost certainly was not Oswald. There was a conspiracy to implicate Oswald in the assassination that involved people within the Mexico City CIA station who were lying in a way to make all of this seem much more plausible than it really was, and who created a memo, for example, as I say in my book, we have determined, I better read this, it's page 41, this officer determined that Oswald had talked with Kostikov. I make a small mistake there because I assumed that this officer was a man, and now from the recently declassified Lopez report from that era, we realize that this person was not a man but a woman, and she was married to a man. I got the husband and wife confused here, but the Lopez report enormously enlarges the evidence that somebody was impersonating Oswald, probably a short, aging blonde. I didn't make too much of the blonde thing because I thought that whereas Consul Azque in the Cuban embassy called him a blonde, I thought that Sylvia Duran, who spent the most time with Oswald, didn't. What we now know from the Lopez report is that Duran kept saying over and over back then in November 1963 that she had talked to a blonde. Oswald, of course, was brown-haired. At least the Oswald who was killed in Dallas was brown-haired. So it looks like there was an imposter there, and that wouldn't tell us much by itself, but that the idea of a conspiracy was being improved by false memoranda from within the Mexico City CIA station, reinforced by very vigorous efforts from a very drug-tainted element of the Mexican government, the DFS. This begins to give us an outline of where such a conspiracy might have been. Now, in my book, I'm not trying to solve the case, but I'm content to bring the case back to what I call the deep political facts of Mexico and the United States, the fact that the drug traffic is part of the governmental system in both Mexico and tone it down a bit, but also, and to a certain extent, in Dallas as well.
We're back with Peter Dale Scott. The book is Deep Politics and the Death of JFK. And we're now in Dallas, and we want to talk about the behavior of some of the national security agencies, the FBI, the CIA, military intelligence. Could you give us some clue as to what they were doing and why we might want to question it?
Well, we know least, unfortunately, about military intelligence. They're the agency that destroyed their assassination files despite a request to keep them all going. We know that they sent out cables very quickly after the murder. They probably established the link between Oswald and Hidell, which led him to his being charged for the murder. They also, from Texas, sent a very provocative cable directly to a strike force in Florida that was poised to attack Cuba, making it look as if Oswald was definitely a communist agent in the killing. We can say much, much more about the FBI and the CIA, but before I do, again, I have to get away from the idea of compartmentalizing them. Some of the key people in CIA were formerly FBI agents, including, for example, the head of the Mexican City CIA station, a man called Win Scott, who I hasten to say is not a relative as far as I know. Had worked with an FBI so-called Special Intelligence Service during the war, which was then forcibly incorporated into what became the CIA. And I think Hoover all along had penetrated the CIA through these former SIS agents. I don't know about Scott in particular, but that was the story that a lot of them. William Harvey is another key one here. who ostensibly got angry at Hoover and came over and joined the CIA, but may well have been working for Hoover, even inside the CIA. And then finally, William Sullivan, who was in charge of counterintelligence inside the FBI, had formerly been Win Scott's boss in the SIS. So there is a kind of interpenetration between FBI and CIA here that could be very relevant to what happened, because it looks very much as if one element inside each agency was operating independently of the rest. In the CIA, this looks like the counterintelligence branch, who were, by a bit of Machiavellian conniving, they got themselves the job of representing the CIA to the Warren Commission, and they continued to believe in a conspiracy, apparently versus the FBI, who were gung-ho for Oswald did it alone from the very beginning. There is an AP story on November 25th saying that Hoover had already decided, that the FBI had already decided that it was Lee Harvey Oswald and that he acted alone. And this, of course, is what totally constrained the Warren Commission, as they knew. This is what they chiefly talked about in their first executive session, the fact that the case had already been resolved by the FBI. As far as I'm concerned, one is no more or no less benign than the other. And it may have been that the true assassins may have been those hiding behind the Oswald did it alone thing, and that the people who were saying, no, it was a KGB conspiracy, were less clued in to what really happened. All we can say for a certainty is that there is a great deal of suspect post-assassination behavior. The part that's easiest for me to talk about is in the CIA now because of this declassified Lopez report. But in my book, I talk about how the people who handled the case within the counterintelligence section of FBI, although they were apparently secretly reprimanded at the time, this reprimand can't have meant very much because they were simultaneously entrusted with continuing to investigate the case. There's a great continuity between the FBI people who handled it before the case got reprimanded and then were designated to handle it after the assassination, some of whom, like William Sullivan, went on to very high posts within the FBI. I do think it's very striking that these same people were the people who in the 60s and 70s were running the COINTELPROs. I looked at a lot of the COINTELPRO documents when they were declassified. It was very striking to me that the files were reasonably complete on all kinds of organizations, particularly the Socialist Workers' Party or the Trotskyites, but not the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. And it remains quite possible that Oswald himself was part of a COINTELPRO against the Fair Play for Cuba Committee because he involved himself with them, not vice versa. He pretended to be doing things on behalf of them in New Orleans when in fact he was, whether or not he was a loner, we don't know, but the links that we know of between Oswald and the Fair Play for Cuba Committee are absolutely minimal. And one of the things that the FBI and the CIA both certainly did was cover up Oswald's links to 544 Camp Street, where you had a man whom the CIA tell us was reporting regularly to the FBI on COINTELPRO type activities. Now, this is where deep politics come in, because that man, Guy Bannister, there's been a lot of debate between those who say he's FBI and those, or ONI, Office of Naval Intelligence, versus those who say, no, he's mafia because he knew Ray Gill, who was Marcello's lawyer. A deep political analysis isn't going to make too much out of this sort of thing, because the fact is you had a milieu in New Orleans, which is well represented by Guy Bannister, in which organized crime and law enforcement are doing each other's other failures. So it would be wrong to overly compartmentalize here. So you might say that the deep political components of this case were filtered out by both FBI and CIA, and strikingly by those people who had the strongest deep political connections themselves.
All right, we are running out of time. We have a few more minutes. I want to ask essentially the same question that I asked when we started this interview. And since you are also a noted poet and have written your share of poetry, let me come to this question by quoting a poem by the late Muriel Rukeyser. She wrote a poem called Islands. Mm-hmm. And the first line of that poem goes, "Oh, for God's sake, they are connected underneath." The bathers.
The theme of my book.
So let me ask you the question this way: What does Ethel Rosenberg's death, the McCarthy era, the killing of Kennedys, plural, Watergate, and Contragate, what do they have in common institutionally, economically, in terms of their relationship with the economy of the country, and in terms of the players? You talked earlier about Frank Sturgis being a carryover. Are there other players who keep showing up again and again in these different operations that we might be curious
Well,
about?
certainly inside the government there are a great many. I mean, Angleton, for example, obviously was mistrusted the government he was working for. He believed that Averell Harriman, who was Kennedy's designated ambassador, both in trouble areas, but a very important man, more important than his nominal post. Angleton believed he was a KGB agent. And then when Nixon was president of the United States, Angleton believed that Henry Kissinger was a KGB agent. And the belief that Kissinger was a KGB agent is part of the underpinnings of Watergate. Generally, what I point out is that in crisis after crisis, every decade we have seen American politics momentarily contorted by an event, the McCarthy hearings, for example, or the Kennedy assassination, Watergate, Contragate. What is consistent all the way through, even forcing the point to Iran-Contra, which had many other factors in it, is that you had presidents at a moment that they were contemplating détente with the Soviet Union, and that did not serve the purpose of the various agencies who had built themselves up in terms of fighting and containing the Cold War. This is as true of the FBI as anyone else. And something happened to sustain the Cold War. In effect, the U.S. government was purged in the early 50s of all those people who threatened to allow détente to happen, especially after Stalin died. The threat of a phased withdrawal from Vietnam and also normalization with Cuba, which was happening at the same time, were offset by the president, by the assassination of the president. Nixon had just been to Moscow and signed the SALT I agreements a month before these people went into the Democratic National Committee and ultimately castrated him as a president and forced his resignation. So that we see a system which from time to time threatened to realign itself away from the determined prosecution of the Cold War, and all of these events, apparently accidental and unrelated, but which under the surface have a remarkable continuity of personnel. I point out how one of the... first of all, the point is that the system adjusted itself in all four cases by purging people, by the assassination of a president in a plot which must have involved some people within the government, although not probably not confined to the government. And we've talked very little about corporate involvement here, but I do talk about it in my book.
Well, say 2 minutes. Take 2 minutes. We've got 2 minutes. We might as well end on the best part.
Well, I don't know what is the best part.
The worst part.
Let me end on an act of faith. I mean, I think what the sort of thing I'm talking about here would say, oh yeah, I knew the system stank anyway. It just shows that you can never solve something like an assassination. That is not the message of this book. I say all the way through that we live in a partly open society. It's open enough for us to be able to become more conscious of the deep political factors that are at work. This recent declassification of over 90,000 pages from the CIA alone, it makes us aware that there's 170,000 pages they didn't declassify, but it will increase the pressure to get them declassified as well. And I argue that even if we don't get to the whole truth, working to get more of the truth will work to make our society a little more open, and this in turn will mean that the COINTELPROs and the dirty tricks against individuals, and particularly against the kind of people who listen to KPFA, are robbed of their power, just as we saw in the wake of Watergate, a kind of new set of rules to limit and restrict the activities of both the FBI and the CIA.
I want to thank you, Peter Dale Scott, for joining us. A new book, Deep Politics and the Death of JFK. It's put out by the University of California. And it's a big, thick book. It's over 400 pages. We have only, and I do not kid you, barely scratched the surface of this very good work of research and analysis. Thank you very much, Peter Dale Scott.
Thank you.